Good morning. My name is Jerold Kayden, and I'm the Frank Backus Williams Professor of Urban Planning and Design here at the Graduate School of Design, and I'm also an alumnus of the school. I'm delighted to serve as Master of Ceremonies this morning, and what a ceremony it is, thanks to Moisen, to Beth, and all of the others who have spent the past months putting together this incredible day for us. So thank you, all of you, and I think let's give them a hand of applause, please. Two of this morning's sessions tackle the subject of urbanization, a subject that attracts red-hot interest not only from the professions represented at our school, but from sociologists, historians, economists, public health specialists, lawyers, business people, climate change scientists, civic activists. The list is almost endless. Everyone wants in. Of course, the most meaningful attention comes from people who already live or will be living in cities worldwide. While we can, and indeed will, critically examine what is meant by the word urban, we must take account of the fact that more and more people are living in what may be deemed urban settings rather than rural settings. Under any view, we are an urbanized planet. Are we prepared for that condition? What fresh opportunities and challenges does that pose to the provision of sustainable, equitable, productive, and beautiful places in which people of all economic and social circumstances may live, work, learn, participate, enjoy, and experience meaningful connections with others? Johannesburg, Guangzhou, Istanbul, Mexico City, St. Louis, Mumbai, Jakarta, Madrid, the names of known and lesser known places urbanizing and sometimes de-urbanizing under shared and unique circumstances is both exhilarating and daunting. In many of these cities, questions revolve around fundamental human rights: enough food to eat, adequate health care, surviving the nightmare of Ebola, educational opportunities, jobs, basic safety, protection from natural and human-made disasters. In other cities, the problems may be less severe, but the scramble day-to-day for meaningful and enjoyable lives seems very real. Today's existential threats, with climate change front and center, unite cities worldwide, even if a unified strategy and governance structure has yet to be determined. As designers and planners, we play a fundamental role in what urbanization can mean to people, because all human aspirations are realized or frustrated within buildings, infrastructure, public space, and landscapes that we help create with an enduring faith that our physical interventions will improve social outcomes. Although there is some question about his exact words, Churchill famously told the British House of Commons, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." I couldn't say it better. So as I understand, my job this morning is to act as moderator of moderators, a sort of meta-moderator, I guess. Thus, I'm delighted to turn to Charles Waldheim, the John E. Irving Professor of Landscape Architecture and Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture, to moderate the first panel, and to note with great appreciation that his chair carries the name of another chair, indeed the co-chair of the GSD's capital campaign, John E. Irving. Charles.
Thanks very much, Jerold. Welcome back. It's lovely to see everyone here this morning. And speaking of the Irving Chair, I just want to begin on a personal note to let you know how deeply honored I am to be the first holder of that endowed chair, named for Jack Irving. And I think we all share the sense of how fortunate we are to have John Irving's leadership in this campaign for us. Over the last several months and years, as I've come to know John and the Irving family, especially in the run-up to this launch event. We've spent quite a lot of time together in various settings, a number of meetings, and often, particularly at the end of fairly long days, John has this capacity to take a pause and say, with a kind of rhetorical clarity that I greatly appreciate, it's important. And for me, I couldn't sum up more succinctly or eloquently what's at stake for us today. And I couldn't think of a subject more worthy of that appellation and signifying the importance of the work of this campaign and the renewal of this school going forward than urbanization. The Harvard Graduate School of Design and its antecedent schools of architecture and landscape architecture have been preeminent venues in the vanguard for the study of the urban for over a century, beginning with coursework and degree programs in architecture in the 1890s, the formation of the world's first program in landscape architecture at the turn of the previous century. Harvard's design disciplines have been at the forefront of depicting and defining the culture and conditions of the city. This preeminence, of course, continued through the 20th century with the formation of city planning in the 1920s and the invention of urban design in the 1950s. Taken collectively, these fields and their faculty have described both the effects and causes of urbanization, as well as the disciplinary and professional capacity for the conception, curation, and craft of the city as an object of design. In the 21st century, the school has been central to the debates of our age relative to the urban, and the school's faculty and students have examined a range of topics from ecological urbanism, extreme urbanism, and planetary urbanism. As we know, the study of the city rarely corresponds to discrete disciplinary or professional boundaries, and over the past century, the empirical realities of urbanization on the ground, as it were, have consistently outpaced our analytical and descriptive tools to describe it. Given these limits to our current discourse on the city, today's panel begins with what's next? What sites and subjects for the study of the city afford themselves today and tomorrow and over the course of the next several years? We're fortunate to be joined by an extraordinary panel of 7 international figures on this question. We have asked each of them to prepare a very brief position statement, and let me pause and reiterate the significance of the adjective brief. As a provocation for the future of the urban arts at Harvard and beyond, we asked them, what are the terms and the tools for the description of urbanization today? What are the potentials of these conditions for the professions represented here at the school? And what might the implication of these conditions be for the disciplines professed here? We thought it fitting to begin with the seated chair of urban planning, Rahul Mehrotra. Rahul Mehrotra is professor of urban design and planning here at the school and serves as chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design. He is also founder and principal of RMA Architects in Mumbai. He'll be followed by Neil Brenner. Neil Brenner is professor of urban theory and director of the Urban Theory Lab here at the school. Neil will be followed by Diane Davis. Diane Davis is professor of urbanism and development, and she, as did Neil, as did I, hold the appellation of AM, which is Master of Arts, for those of you that were asking earlier, which is, for those of you who know this, understand that when you're appointed to the senior faculty of the school, and if you've not had the benefit of a Harvard degree, they gift you one. So the AM is a Master of Arts. Diane Davis received her Master of Arts in 2012, just after joining the faculty. We're following Diane Davis with Chris Lee. Chris Lee is associate professor in the practice of urban design. He is also co-founder and principal of Siri Architects based in London, Mumbai, and Beijing. So it's astonishing he's here, not in an airport this morning. Chris has been leading the Harvard GSD AECOM project on the Chinese city. Chris will be followed by Lars Lerup. Lars Lerup is the Harry K. and Albert K. Smith Professor in Architecture and Dean Emeritus of the Rice University School of Architecture. Lars completed his Master of Arts in Urban Design degree here, or I should say in Robinson Hall, in 1970. Lars will be followed by Martha Welborn. Martha Welborn is a Loeb Fellow, class of 1992, and she serves as Executive Director of Countywide Planning for the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And finally, we'll conclude with a response to the 6 previous presentations by our own Jorge Silvetti, the Nelson Robinson Jr. Professor of Architecture and former chair of the Department of Architecture and founder of Machado and Silvetti. Rahul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charles, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel, and we're going to hear rapid fire over the next many minutes with the 5 minutes we have. Charles has posed, I think, 3 really sharp questions about the terms and tools and the description of urbanization, the potential of these conditions for the profession represented by the GSD, and the implications for the discipline professed here. Good, sharp questions. The other big one is up there: ecological urbanism, planetary urbanism, extreme urbanism, what next? My colleague Michael Hayes might have responded in these 5 minutes with a wonderful dance, but I'm going to put this exclamatory question, which I'll sort of avoid, because it really makes me feel that this kind sort of gets misunderstood, and these are really rubrics that are useful in the way we organize our own research. It's not about, as corporations, well, I guess we are a corporation, about claiming these areas and asking what next, but rather I think it would be useful to speculate and complicate what's happening within these rubrics and build on this rather than get ahead of the curve in terms of what we can claim, and I think the panelists are going to do just that. So I want to kick this off by sharing, in a sense, the position and perhaps the common ground, as I see it, of the Urban Planning and Design Department in the school, then that at least historically and or more recently has been charged with professing questions around urbanization and the disciplines of urban planning and design. I would say that we've been focused on the scalar question, as this sort of common one, well, all the way to planetary urbanism, where the very limits of the urban, or more specifically the city, are fundamentally challenged. In conjunction with this more abstract, let's say, less locally founded preoccupation is a simultaneous engagement with extremely specific geographies where we've been involved through deep engagement, and picking rather mindfully these specific but often extreme conditions, thus the rubric of extreme urbanism. And for us to work at both ends of the spectrum has been deliberate in order to really construct a condition where the zooming out, the theorizing, the abstraction of specific conditions coexists with the expertise and impulses to excavate as deeply as possible in specific terrain. But more importantly, the common ground, I believe, in these discussions has been that the places, artifacts that we study, whether at the scale of the city or a building, are often not what we see. Does the built artifact of the city, the environment more generally, and the conditions we set up for its examinations already become extremely biased by the aestheticization of the condition? I think this is a critical question. In fact, as we know, the processes that lead to the making of these artifacts and the people that occupy them, the complex relationships and forms of politics that occur between humans, etc., it is this reading that tells you a completely different story and is often far removed from what our preliminary perceptions suggest. Thus, looking at extreme conditions has been one way to drill deep, drill specifically, and excavate all these complex layers that equip us in different ways to understand the problem. That is to stack the natural, man-made, the social layers in a configuration of more complex readings that could potentially equip us better as professionals to engage in this endeavor to make our habitat not only more robust but more pleasurable to occupy. But more importantly, this emphasis on the process and the ability to theorize these specific readings to multiple scales is the large challenge for the discipline. And I'm sure some of my colleagues are going to allude to these challenges, so I won't elaborate this further. But I think one of the next big challenges that we've not adequately addressed, theorized, or critically interrogated within the debate of urbanization is the notion of permanence as a basic condition of cities, or even the process of urbanization for that matter. I think the discourse on urbanism would benefit by dissolving the binary divisions of the ephemeral versus stable components in cities. For in realities, when cities are analyzed over large temporal spans, the ephemeral emerges as an important condition in the life cycle of every built environment. As I mentioned earlier, given that cities are complex overlays of buildings and activities that are in one way or another temporary, why have the disciplines been so obsessed, been focused so much on the idea of permanence? Imagine a gradient from a more permanent towards a more ephemeral configuration. We should focus the discussion on the conditions that are explicitly ephemeral, allowing us to observe extreme conditions of temporary space occupation grounded in any specific territory. In this imagination, the distinction between the permanent and the ephemeral is not a binary, referring to what remains versus what vanishes. Instead, it activates a broader concept of permanence in its meaning of what is more stable, static, persistent in relation to what is impermanent, but also what is the constant process of internal transformation, renewal, reinvention, allowing for greater levels of instability. This approach then embraces a longer temporal scale from the forces of growth Again, a misfounded assumption in the discussions about urbanization to tendencies of shrinkage, depopulation, reabsorption, displacement on account of disaster, climate change, etc. I think an important challenge going forward for the discussion of urbanization is to develop tools for intervening and thinking about non-permanent configurations as a legitimate, productive category within the discourse on urbanism. In fact, they represent an entire surrogate urban ecology that grows and disappears on an often extremely tight temporal scale. When temporal urban landscapes are seen as an expression of distinctive forms of urbanism, a potentially productive dialogue could be established between our urban landscapes and ephemeral settlements as diverse as those for refuge, disaster, transaction, celebration, religion. In our own mapping here at the school, we've come up with about 500 of these that accommodate millions of people every year, sometimes even megacities. And I think it's by engaging with these questions such as these, we will not only find new configurations for interdisciplinary work, something that we are really engaged with trying to get around, but also will be challenged by new forms and contingencies in our speculation of the future, which is perhaps the sharpest instrument we have in our repertoire as urbanists, planners, and designers, one that squarely defines our role in society, which is to really imagine better spatial configurations for the way we occupy, in the broadest sense of the word, planet Earth. Thank you.
So, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion. My remarks here are based not only on my own ongoing research, but on the work of the Urban Theory Lab, a research collective which we set up 3 years ago when I joined the faculty of the GSD. The Urban Theory Lab is an interdisciplinary collaboration between urban social scientists such as myself, as well as architects, landscape architects, urban designers, planners, and critical cartographers. Our work aims to decipher early 21st century urbanization processes, not only through concrete forms of research on specific places and territories, but through the development of new theoretical approaches, new concepts of the urban through which to think about the contemporary planetary condition. We aim to use such approaches to map the geographies of contemporary urbanization in new and potentially illuminating ways. We have found that the work of theory is hugely relevant to the question of how to understand and to map the contemporary urban condition. Just as importantly, we believe, theoretically reflexive research can directly animate and inspire our ongoing collective efforts to intervene in and reshape the built and unbuilt environments of the world. Let me illustrate this agenda with reference to what has become one of the most widely repeated tropes about the contemporary global urban condition, namely the notion that humanity has crossed an important threshold because more than 50% of the world's population today purportedly lives within cities. This vision of the urban age is derived from the United Nations data tables, the World Urbanization Prospects, and it is widely repeated in mainstream global urban discourse by governments, by international organizations, by planning and design professionals, by the news media, and indeed by many urban researchers. I regularly see it in thesis proposals, doctoral dissertations, grant proposals, and so forth. Our research in the Urban Theory Lab suggests that this is a thoroughly misleading way of understanding our contemporary urban situation. While it may be broadly true that big urban centers are growing around the world, we believe that the 50% urban trope obfuscates much more than it reveals about what is actually happening. So time is short, but let me briefly outline 3 core problems, each of which opens up a key research agenda that we're trying to pursue in the lab. Number 1, the notion of an urban transition is empirically incoherent. The UN relies on national census data which define the city and the urban in extraordinarily diverse ways. Sometimes it's an urban population threshold, which is 200, sometimes it's 10,000. Sometimes it's an urban density gradient. Sometimes it's an employment criterion, and sometimes it's simply a governmental territorial classification. So in empirical terms, the proclamation that we have collectively reached a 50% urban threshold is shaky at best. It is a sweeping generalization based on the aggregation of data which is based on incompatible definitions of the phenomenon that's supposedly being measured. So the task here that arises is we need much better systems of global data collection and more coherent typologies for classifying changing forms of territorial organization, land cover, and land use at all spatial scales from the global to the local. Such systems would be an essential basis for understanding the rapidly changing conditions in which urban designers and planners operate. So that's already one big problem. Second problem, the universalizing discourse of a global rural to urban transition hides the extraordinary diversity of urbanization processes around the world. Claiming that most people live in cities has meaning only if we agree on a theoretical and conceptual level about what cities actually are. Yet, contemporary urban formations around the world assume extremely diverse forms. The old sociological definitions, based on size, density, and heterogeneity, or even theories of agglomeration from my own discipline of economic geography, cannot in themselves adequately illuminate the specific patterns and pathways of urbanization that are crystallizing, say, in East Asia, in West Africa, in the Ganges Plain, or even in parts of North America and Europe. It is a stunning oversimplification to describe such variegated geographies of urbanization under the rubric of a single universal category such as that of the city. So the task that arises here is that we urgently need a theory of the global urban condition that is directly attuned to the variegated patterns and pathways of urbanization, rather than simply viewing them as derivations from some universal form or condition. Final point, final critique. What about the non-urban? Most importantly for our work in the Urban Theory Lab, global urban age discourse is myopically city-centric. It brackets the ways in which the growth of large agglomerations hinges upon relations to and transformations of distant territories, landscapes, and environments. Indeed, the formation of a world in which more and more people inhabit large, dense population centers is inconceivable in the absence of major, often highly destructive social and environmental transformations in many of the world's most remote regions, which have become something like a standing reserve, or in the terms we're using in the Urban Theory Lab, operational landscapes that support urban growth. Questions about food, fuel, energy, waste, zones of resource extraction, agro-industrial territories, logistics landscapes, migration patterns, all these become operationally essential elements within an uneven and world-encompassing urban fabric that supports the growth of agglomerations. So in our lab, we think of these spaces as operational landscapes of extended urbanization, not simply the hinterland, because they are spaces of quite dynamic transformation, not least through large-scale infrastructural, land use, and environmental interventions, and we believe that designers and planners have a key role in understanding and shaping these extended landscapes of urbanization. So the task that flows from this is that we need a theory of urbanization that is attuned not only to the condition of agglomeration, but to the transformative processes beyond the agglomeration that are required to support its growth. So the notion, in closing, the notion of planetary urbanization that we've been developing in the Urban Theory Lab is intended as a strong counterpoint to urban age discourse. It's not simply a world of cities, but new kinds of relations between large, rapidly changing cities and ongoing transformations in the operational landscapes that support these big cities. So planning and designing for the urban age for us means that we have to rethink how cities connect, not just to one another, but to the broader operational landscapes that sustain them. Even for those of us who may be focused on the cities as zones of intervention, we can't understand what's going on within them unless we look outside them, far outside them. So this suggests new terrains for thinking the urban, new challenges for developing an adequate map of our urbanized planet beyond the cities, and above all, new challenges for harnessing the capacities of design to shape and reshape the built and unbuilt environments of the earth. Thank you very much.
So let me get right to the point. We cannot think about the future of urbanization or the built environment more generally without framing it through the lens of risk. Risk is everywhere, and it takes many forms. It manifests itself in environmental vulnerabilities and climate change disasters like flooding and hurricanes. It haunts us in the unthinkable but pending arrival of terror and other forms of conflict and violence. It scares us in the spread of health epidemics and plagues that circulate through face-to-face contact. And it still confronts us in the more commonly understood forms like financial and market risk, many of which have been exacerbated by overbuilding and the mortgage crisis, but some of which also are a product of the globalization of investments in the built environment, which have fueled the wildly civilized growth of cities and regions in ways that consume critical environmental resources and create new spatial conditions that contribute to new forms of unsustainability, vulnerability, and risk. Whatever form it takes, however, the world today is replete with a wide range of risks and precarities produced by prior patterns of urbanization. As we look towards the future, then, we must consider risk as a defining feature of our times. And this means we must learn how to build, design, and plan for it. To do so will inevitably require new guiding principles and paradigms. In the heyday of modernism, professional designers, architects, and planners were motivated by dreams of order, a commitment founded on the belief that tensions between the natural and the built and social environment could be managed, if not overcome. When modernist paradigms ruled, the tendency to build bigger and better was fueled by a belief in the inevitability of progress and the sense that any new urban or built environmental challenge could be resolved if enough technology, money, and creativity was thrown at it. In a risk society, we must recognize that many of the strategies associated with that agenda have created insurmountable problems for us today. Because of this, we need new techniques as well as new ways of thinking about the form and connectivity of cities that can respond and counter the strategies of the past. In addressing these challenges, many of us at the GSD are rethinking our teaching and research priorities. In addition to the huge commitment to enabling a resilient urbanism that makes sense in the context of ecology and a healthier green environment, we are learning to value and embrace flexibility, not fixity, as a concept in the design of buildings, land uses, and urban infrastructure. Sometimes even embracing the benefits of informality over formality, if only to allow for dynamism rather than fixity in city form and function. We are also learning how to identify, map, and communicate urban and environmental risks in ways that are legible to citizens and city builders, with the hope that they in turn will support the design and building practices that we are promoting in the service of building better cities. But some of these strategies imply a belief, paradoxically, in the conquering of the problem of risk in ways that may too readily echo modernist sensibilities. The stark truth is that risk as a concept does not reside only in the domain of science and the factual. It is deeply informed by power and social questions, including who has the right or authority to define risk, how is risk distributed, who pays for it, and who gains from it. In that sense, we also have to be humbled by a recognition of the tyranny of risk and understand that discourses of risk can be abused as much as used to justify limited public space, separation, gating, and other forms of exclusion that challenge the social and equity principles that also guide our work. As professionals, we have to be prepared to confront these dilemmas and these paradoxes, in fact, contradictions. I have found this not just in my own work on cities in conflict and post-conflict settings, where the daily experience of risk can be so overwhelming that standard design and reconstruction strategies are impossible to implement because of instabilities. But I've also found it where in those situations, who or what is at risk is under constant debate and not entirely clear. Complicating our task as professionals, in many urban settings around the world, multiple forms of risk overlap in ways that call into question action strategies built around a singular framing of the problem, whether scalar or disciplinary. The intertwining of risks in contemporary life requires a whole new way of thinking about cities, their form and governance, and the urban experience. Confronting this reality will require more interdisciplinary interaction and dialogue among the various planning, design, and architectural professions, who will need allies in the social sciences, public health, and engineering professions. And this, to put it simply, means that there may be an upside to the emergence of risk, at least for us at the GSD, because it holds a potential to create new disciplinary synergies and to bring a wide range of disparate experts together to jointly address the multiple vulnerabilities of urban life. In our risk and resilience program in the MDES and through a variety of our programs across the departments, these goals define future studies of urbanism at the GSD.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I've titled this short presentation, Whatever Happened to the Idea of the City? Urbanization used to be reactive. It was the provision of housing, amenities, and supporting infrastructure for the proletariat, a reaction to real demands of the expanding city. Today, especially in Far East Asia and in particular China, urbanization is speculative. It's a predictive provision based on current product differentiation for the developmental city. The developmental city is a city used primarily as a developmental tool, instigated by speculative capital and orchestrated by local governments. Urbanization becomes an economic driver in itself. This form of urbanization places the demands of the market above all consideration. The developmental city has a few distinct characteristics. It is constructed rapidly from the generic proliferation of megaplots, 5 to 10 times the size of a Manhattan block. It serves up an urbanism of enclaves, fragmented and closed off according to social classes, an urban landscape of inflated and duplicated roads, spaced out towers, oversized building blocks, and lifeless ground planes. The developmental city is also characterized by its tendency to define itself through its strategic positioning in contraposition to other cities, often exacerbating the comparative difference to gain a competitive advantage. This tendency to over-specialize sets up distinct labor and social classes, stratifies spaces, and limits opportunities. This laissez-faire attitude towards city-making results in a city that is inequitable, divided, bordered, exclusive, wasteful, polluted, and vulnerable. The city is dissolved, illegible, and bereft of a civic dimension and a public sphere. This dissolution into a sea of enclave urbanism does not constitute the idea of the city, either in the European tradition as a space of plural coexistence or in the Chinese sense, where the city is seen as an accommodative framework with a clear and legible structure that regulates its space and social structure. Architectural and urban design in these circumstances is consigned to the mere management of the practicalities of urbanization on the one hand and hubristic place promotion on the other. Coupled with the loss of confidence from the fallout of the failure of utopianism of modernism, it is unable and perhaps reluctant to project any alternative futures through design speculation. But if design is the elegant synthesis of irreconcilable and contradictory demands, then it is well equipped to bring forth an alternative future of the city that is more plural, equitable, stimulating, dignified, and nourishing. The task perhaps is in the design of a common framework, an organizing structure that reifies the idea of the city as a space of equal and plural coexistence. It is an architecture, landscape, infrastructure that serves as a background, accommodating the multiplicities of city life, making difference apparent and meaningful. Conceived as a discursive idea, realized through addition and accumulation, it is most poignant when it is shared, lived, experienced, and viewed as a whole, as a city, a collective work of art. Indeed, only by understanding the logics of the developmental city can we surpass its banality. Thank you.
Since I come from another planet, Texas, I will stick to that. I am very pleased to come back. And I tell you, the food at Robinson Hall is much better than it used to be. Now, I will take 2 minutes. And since I speak slowly, since I'm an older gentleman, I will probably need an extra minute or so. But I will start quoting Charles' position statement. In the 21st century, GST has been central to the debates of our age relative to the urban, and the schools, faculty, and students have examined a range of topics from ecological urbanism, extreme urbanism, and planetary urbanism. Given that the study of the city rarely corresponds to compact disciplinary or professional boundaries, and given that history suggests and attempts to describe and delimit the urban ultimately gives way to the overwhelming empirical evidence of the city's inability to be contained. What next? What sites and subjects for the study of the city afford themselves today and tomorrow? So here's me. As Charles' positions paper suggests, labels and their associated perspectives on the urban have short lifespans. However, there is one persistent label with astonishing longevity: sprawl. It stays on, despite its obvious glibness and uselessness, even as the much younger sustainability is receding in favor of resilience. I've attacked sprawl in 2 books, quixotically to no apparent avail, but I'm still at it. And here I present a new label that is prefigured and foreshadowed by Charles's landscape urbanism. Obscured under the impenetrable sprawl, the city of Houston has suffered repeated indignities, some of them deserved, but most missing an opportunity to better understand a major urban phenomena. But let me take a step back. Since the vocabulary of urbanism has centered on the dense city, few conceptual tools exist to better describe the workings of the distributed city. So I had to go back and look. Those efforts leading to the work in After the City and later in 1 Million Acres and No Zoning, but I had a tough problem. Although I created a slew of new labels, Megashape, Stim and Dross, Zoemic Canopy, and Speed Zone, something was still missing. Then I encountered flat ontology, a newish philosophical orientation under the auspices of the post-human, and I had a eureka moment. Water. Much earlier, having had trouble with binary thinking, mind and body, right and wrong, nature and artifice, city and suburb, I began to approach with new clarity with an investigation of a penultimate coupling. Drawing a virtual section of the park, the street, and the swimming pool 15 floors below me, I realized that instead of 2 opposites, I see a force field that at one end is dominated by naturally grown objects, while at my end, it is manually and industrially manipulated natural objects that dominate. Since I have implied, not yet quite explicitly, that this field is neither nature nor artifice, a third condition appears, based on a series of analogical relationships rather than dichotomies. Here the ensemble is transformed into what Giorgio Agamben describes as a force field traversed by polar tensions, whereas in an electromagnetic field, the identities evaporate. When cutting a section in the spirit of an archaeological excavation, we easily see how the polar tensions develop, relying on the natural to do its work, rises in the park, while in the building domain, human manipulation of natural elements increases. As in a magnetic field, we're dealing not with the extensive and scalable magnitudes, but with vectorial intensities. Suddenly, the natural shoots through to permeate both domains, suggesting that the work of the tree and the grass, both splendid solar pumps using soil and sun to its fullest, are analogous to the concrete mixer that is rotating water, ballast, and cement to shape the 16th floor slab in which I stand to make my observations. While the electricity driving the mixer is shipped in from a field of solar panels, that operational landscape, sitting in a barren swath of desert far beyond the city, however unrealistic they may sound in the ultimate petro city of the world. Simultaneously, this flattening reflects the slow shift away from a largely anthropocentric view of the world and us. As Michel Foucault wagered almost 50 years ago, man will be erased like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea. What is left to us is a constant reminder of our past deeds, now in the form of a roving hyperobject aptly known as the Anthropocene. Just as Charles slipped the landscape like a tortilla under urbanism, in my flat urbanism, not to distinguish from spiky urbanism, ontologically speaking, we can no longer distinguish the dancer from the dance. The new flat urbanism, literally flat as well as ontologically flattened, erases the distinction between the old city and the faubourg, between our city and the suburb. In Houston, such flatness threatens the hopelessly antiquated domains of city and county. And in light of Houston's urbanities, flooding Donald Judd's Marfa, flatness is also threatening the geography of Houston by expanding virtually. Suddenly, cities are too familiar, confusingly too small, and simultaneously too large, conceptually too emblematic, hermetic, and closed. Surreptitiously, we have slipped into a time of metabolic entities, suggesting that the city has become a splayed, obese body filled with sloppy organs, a biological entity whose horizon is forever expanding and contracting. So that is what is next. In the end, urbanists may all live at IKEA, dabbling in urban metabolics by going to internet med school.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really honored to be here today, especially with so many visionaries. But I have to warn you now, you're going to hear from the truly grounded one. As the only non-academic on this panel, I have chosen to represent the side of all of our professions who exclusively focus on getting things built. People who wake up every morning and can't wait to achieve the next milestone in getting their current project up and running. And no matter what the issue is that's about to kill the project, whether it be political, legal, funding, whatever, the grounded visionary will find a way and get the project built. So coming from this point of view, I'd like to put forth one key area of discussion: product versus process. In my nearly 40-year career, I've learned over time that I need to embrace the process of working in cities to be effective at getting impactful projects built. Not moan about endless community meetings or lack of sufficient funding, but really take charge of creating a process to make that project happen. Willa von Moltke, who led the urban design department here at the GSD for many years, used to say urban design is 10% design and 90% diplomacy. Diplomacy is not a term used in our professions much today, but Willa was, of course, totally right. Today, we work in challenging urban environments to solve intractable problems at a time when our work is highly regulated, highly scrutinized, when it costs any objector only $25 to file a lawsuit that could delay a project a year or more, and when politicians and even architecture critics, with the exception of Bob Campbell if he's here in the room, can launch campaigns to kill a project even if it is already funded and has community support. So especially when working at the urban scale, my position is embrace the process. Understand it, use it. It is not your enemy. It's actually one of the tools in the urban designer's arsenal, and perhaps the most powerful one. Is the product important too? Of course. We all agree with that. But my pitch here is that both students and professionals need to understand both how to create a vision and how to create a process. Creating a vision alone is not enough. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. At LA Metro, around 2005 or so, we had big dreams about expanding our rail transit system. We had a plan, but we had no funding. Federal dollars for transportation were and still are shrinking, so we launched an effort to create our own funding. We started with an informational campaign to explain to the public why Metro is good for you. Then we polled the public to determine which projects they were most interested in, and finally we got Measure R on the ballot in 2008. In spite of a 2/3 vote requirement, the measure passed. We are now adding 82 miles to our existing 132-mile system to the tune of $20 billion in combined federal, state, and local funding. And I really mean what we're saying here. We have 5 rail projects under construction right now and 5 more to come. Another quick example of creating an effective process concerns the Grand Avenue project, which I worked on for many years. Just get this. In this case, in 2001, the Walt Disney Concert Hall was almost finished, but it sat like an island in the middle of parking lots at the edge of the music center. Eli Broad and others thought we should turn these parking lots into a new center of downtown Los Angeles. Working with Eli and others, we formed a new nonprofit, created a vision of what this part of town could be. Since the land was owned by the city and county, we then convinced the 2 governments to form a joint powers authority. We essentially created a new government. We then convinced the Joint Powers Authority to assign our nonprofit to serve as their staff. Once our role was secured, we then issued an RFP, selected a developer, and 10 years later, a new 12-acre park is open to great acclaim. 2 buildings are under construction, and the centerpiece parcel is finally under design again after a delay caused by the recession. I could give day-long seminars on each of these projects, but my point is understanding and creatively using the process of getting visions built is an essential skill for all of our professions, but especially for those of us working at the large urban scale. So I urge you all to go out there and create a new government, set up a new nonprofit, or put a referendum on the ballot, whatever it takes to get your vision built. And don't forget what Willow said, urban design is 10% design and 90% diplomacy. Thank you.
Okay, just a few preliminary words about how I came to be sitting here. I was asked to be here, and my first reaction was to be scared and talk to the dean and say, no, this is not my kind of panel. Ecological, planetary, and extreme, they scare me. But the dean is very convincing and persuasive, which is good for the campaign, I have to say. He used a turn of words that sounded right to me, and here I am. He repeated the adjectives with great enthusiasm, ecological, planetary, extreme, all the things we do. But then he says that there should be an attempt to bring them into form, by which I understood, from my biased perspective, a change of scale, probably. For what preoccupies me is not so much that we are going planetary, ecological, or extreme, and the kind of grandiloquence they suggest. That we have a globe actually turning outside, showing how far, how global, planetary, and universal we extend our reach. As a matter of fact, I actually think that is good. It is really in the DNA of the GSD since its beginnings. We do big well. We do that like no one else. But what preoccupies me, and I'm speaking today really more than anything as an educator, is how we articulate the bigness of thought and outreach in what we do here in school with these projects, and of course, on how we do that outside too in the world. But in the world, the scale of intervention is usually decided prior to our entry. But here at the school, we can play with it. Perhaps because within the school we are free to set the parameters and dimensions of our projects, there is an inherent, endemic tendency among architects at least to go big when we are in the speculative mode. Big about what we want to do, big about what the size of problems we want to tackle, big about the reach of our projects. It is inevitable, and it is good. The city and the landscape have been and continue to be since the times when we began to speculate as architects, that is to say, since the Renaissance, what we really always use as our terms of references. Yet, the overwhelming evidence and contestable evidence is that in contradistinction to the size of things we think and speculate about and desire, the relative dimensions of what we are allowed or invited to act upon are small or smaller, more modest, and in effective terms
fragmentary. And it is not an issue for me, not for the school, that the writing argument also often heard today that architecture is irrelevant in relation to the larger problems and ineffective of trivial role in the grand scale of things. The issue, in fact, is that architecture is the dominant scale of intervention in the city today. That is, so for those that consider it irrelevant, perhaps the best advice is that they leave those tasks to those of us that still want to give it a try. It is, in fact, very simple to understand. We all know that, but it is worth always remembering it. A city never has been the result of a single act of construction, even in the rare cases when all its buildings and infrastructure had been built at one time. Think of Brasilia, which is barely coming into being finally now as a real city more than half a century after its sudden birth. Rather, a city is the result of a process of successive accumulations of smaller actions. We all know this. It is almost a platitude. But also, the other cliche we keep on repeating in most arguments about the city is that of change, that everything changes, that life is in continuous evolution and sporadic revolutions, as if change energizes us all to design always anew. And change, it is true that everything changes. While we never tire of repeating then the mantra of change, and in fact acknowledging one uncontestable aspect of reality, what we forget is that change implies the passing of time, in failing to acknowledge that time is not a single entity equal to all times, but that we should acknowledge and understand the existence of many times, specifying their diverse natures and characteristics. In any endeavor, time cannot be understood only by the measurements, the human origin measurements of the metrics of the 24-hour clock. There are many times that need to be understood in relation to the subject at hand, as in geological time and the time of the atomic particles to move, just to pick two extremes, or for other things. As we speculate about the planetary realities, we should ask ourselves, what is the time of cities? Well, certainly the times of cities is not the times of a human life, nor the time of geology. It takes other kinds of time to make a city than to make a building. What this tells us is that while everything changes all the time, not the whole diversity of things that compose the physical world change at the same time and speed. And frankly, in spite of all the changes, cities do not change that fast as we designers wish. One of the few times, and this is going to resonate with Lars of our times at Berkeley, one of the few times, maybe the only time I agree with Christopher Alexander in my life, was when I was a student there. And I remember, this was in the 70s, and already the craze of what the world was going to look like in year 2000 was all around the school and the architects. And when he was asked what the city of the year 2000 would look like, and to my dismay, he said, pretty much the same as today, somewhat bigger, with larger buildings, more congested. I was at the time overtaken by the images of Archigram and Superstudio, were my idols at the day, and without understanding what their true value was. I think I had the weakness that characterizes much of the current state of architectural production, namely literalism in its interpretation of visions. For in terms of discourse, we think metaphorically, with complete complex images of something else that does not exist, but which stands for all the things we want to be, for the society we want to construct, for the future we wish to achieve. But on the other hand, this resonates with some of my former students sitting there, we act metonymically, actually going only in fragments or emblematic parts, producing them emblematic parts of a whole that the time and resources provided for actions make it impossible to realize in full. We do not understand this fundamental shift of mode of operation between the project and the action. Understanding this shift that actualizes the fragment of a metaphors is what we miss more often than not today, as we believe our utopias literally, which is the frequent current error that no one had committed until modernism somewhat simplified the equation by equating vision with action, institutionalizing a simple-minded mode of operation. We saw last night praise for the much lionized Plan Voisin for Paris, as it was good because that was realized anyway in New York in later decades to great success as an urban form. But those were the illustrations used that I would have used for exactly the opposite argument. For the photograph of the model of the Plan Voisin is the opposite of precisely what happened in New York half a century later. And of course, that it is realized half a century later is not minor detail, but more importantly, the mode of intervention is over time, by many fragmentary interventions, is neither a detail. Closer to us, I cannot think of a better example that I think I don't need to illustrate because all of you know pretty well, of what we have here on campus. Peabody Terrace is a paradigmatic fragment of a larger vision, artfully placed and woven into the urban and natural landscape of centuries-old Cambridge, is as good as it comes. And that could really be a lesson that we seem to be missing when we discuss the planetary, the ecological, and the extreme. I think it is good and appropriate to reflect upon on this happy day by recalling Surt's wisdom and his ability to produce the shift of gears that brought the dream to earth without losing any of its freshness, originality, and visionary image of the future that actually came into being. That, of course, he did with architecture, with scaled open spaces, with paths in a garden, with overhangs and brise-soleil, with concrete and wood. He thought big, he endorsed the most advanced tenets of the day, and he acted at the scale of a given opportunity, managing to weave the utopian fabric with that of the existing. So what's next? Can we in academia, without losing the power to think big and imaginatively about the future, speculate in the other direction, started at the small and seeing how it represents and maybe articulates the existing and then the future? Besides his wheels dancing last night, what I like about Michael Hayes' show was an expression he used as he was elaborating on the title of this weekend's event. He put the finger on a key part. He talked about the enactment of vision, how we make the vision real. What's next? And this is really, for me, an issue that is about methodology and pedagogy. My proposition will be a question and a challenge. How do we become visionaries both in pedagogy and as agents in the transformation of practice so that we instill in our students a real understanding of how interventions in the city work while providing the instruments, intellectual and technical, to build visionary ideas? When thinking about the city, let's also think small. Paradoxically, doing so has become more difficult, more challenging as it is more real. Indeed, it is not a small project. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you to all our panelists for those pithy position papers. So the morning table is set. Thank you so much. I'm going to invite our audience members who have questions and comments to come forward to the microphones and invite you to identify yourself and who you'd like to speak with. But before we do that, I want to open up to the panelists to respond. Any immediate response, questions, queries from the panel? Neil Brenner.
So I'll just throw one thing out. I mean, there's a lot of issues on the table here, but one thing that I hear in kind of almost all the different positions is the search for what we might call a new cognitive map of the world, of the urban, the non-urban, the city, whatever vocabulary you choose. And the challenge, and it's both a practical challenge and it's a pedagogical challenge for us, is that we still have to act. So in other words, we may argue, we may be convinced that inherited models for describing space are inadequate. So it's like, to stay with the vision metaphor, it's like your eyeglass prescription is out of whack. We need to update it. But in the course of updating it, you still have to do stuff. You still have to engage in the world. So I think that's a productive tension that we engage with in the school and that we have to engage with in our work. On the one hand, being willing to adventurously let go of certain inherited concepts, inherited sort of maps of the world in order to think differently about what we might do, but at the same time to remain grounded enough to confront urgent emerging problems all the time. So I'm kind of playing with that conference theme, but I think it connects up exactly with the role of theory in this whole thing, because it's through theory that we can construct the vision. Anyway, that's just a reaction.
Thanks very much for that. So for those of you that have questions, we have microphones on either aisle. Please make your way down. Other thoughts, responses from the panelists?
Well, Charles, maybe I'll. I loved hearing what everybody said, and I really was happy that Jorge brought it down to kind of small scale. So we can think about the dialectic between the small and the planetary, small and large, but I'd like to make a plea for finding a framework that allows you to work across those scales and connect them in multiple ways. I think it's kind of what you're looking at, but if you don't have the right, if the concept of the large vision makes you feel unable to act, you're not going to start making those connections between. So I think the kinds of dialogue we're having on this panel is something that we need to develop across the different departments, because we have students who are working at all these different scales in different ways, and they don't ever get an opportunity to kind of come together like we are now to talk about this and actually search together for that new kind of operational sphere of action. So just a comment.
We'll just assume that you all completely agree with everything that we said.
It seems to me that one of the most important things to realize is that the anthropocentric era is over, and it's going to take a long time to forget. But the notion that the world around us that we have affected so much needs to be brought up on the same level as we, and taken as seriously as we take ourselves. We are opening a Pandora's box of enormous complexity that will require rethinking everywhere. And it's not so much that you have to agree that we have global warming. It is just to realize that that stuff which we have used relentlessly around us needs to be taken much more seriously. And I think that is a dramatic sea change in the way that we also operate as architects and as urbanists. And it's very hard to get your arms around it. And you know, this obsession with sustainability, that nobody has a clue of what it is. Because who knows how to be sustainable? Under the auspices of oil or under the auspices without oil? Well, then we go back to the Stone Age, presumably, and it might not be so bad. But it seems to me that we need to evolve much, much further and really take these new sciences, the new philosophies like flat ontology seriously. And that will help us a lot to understand what our future task is.
We have a question here.
Yes, thank you for such a good presentations. My question goes on in between lines, hearing you, there was also this thing about graduality or gradients, from ephemeral to stable, from temporary to permanent, stability to instability, product to process, and a lot of others. Even there was a question about Neil Brenner that the tipping point of the 50% of urban population actually might not be 07. We don't know quite well. So in those new relative terms, or terms about gradient rather than absolutes, points of rural or urban, or the other ones that I already mentioned, where does that put design as a conceptual theoretical definition, and also as a professional practice, and also as a school? Thank you.
Jerold? Yeah. So the status of design, it came up a couple of times over the course of the morning.
I mean, part of it was directed to this question of 50% threshold, so let me just say something about that. I mean, my point with that is that it's kind of the wrong question to pose about the urban condition. It's like blurry, to stay with the eyeglasses metaphor. It's not like you're completely blind, but what you see is really, really blurry. So for me, the question would not be about do we all live within something that we call a city, but rather, what are the changing relationships between, let's just say loosely, big population centers and the broader world, the broader, what we traditionally classify as the non-urban. That opens up a lot of more specific questions that I think would illuminate the challenges that design has to confront much more productively than simply drawing a circle around the city and look, whatever that means, and looking inside. So part of my point is that in order to pose the question of what can design do, we need a map of where we are and what instruments we have at our disposal. So it's an attempt to kind of put a new prescription into that lens, into that the eyeglasses through which we see the world.
Question on the right here.
Good morning, Charles McKinney. Are there any cities in the world that are cause for optimism?
No.
Or hope?
Sure.
I, for one, am quite hopeful and very optimistic that this school is uniquely positioned to address the urban challenges of the 21st century. How about that? Any takers?
Yeah, I mean, I'm positive. I think there are good things about some cities and have a good future. And if nothing else, it is very enjoyable to be or live in them. I mean, I don't understand the actual direction of the question.
Well, is there any city that we should look to as an example of good leadership?
No, I don't think cities are examples. No, I don't think one should try to emulate other cities. I think that's the beauty of cities, is that they're all different. I mean, you know, and I see it in more as a continuous process. I was saying, you know, the times of cities. I mean, cities always have problems, always have had them, and we always have enjoyed them too. So, I mean, I don't think one can put this in the category of future, you know, hopeful or not hopeful, or, you know, good or bad. I think one just lives in cities and tries to make them better. And, you know, and they're always, cities are very complex things, so some things sometimes don't work. And most of the time, a lot of things do work. That's why we are still all around, you know.
I'd like to add on, if I could add on to this. And in a way, I think it underscores the importance of Neil's point about the preoccupation with the city. Because obviously there are a lot of great things happening in cities. But not every city has solved every problem, or not every city is perfect. So in our classes, it's maybe a small project, make a sectoral change. There's still plenty of problems, but there are so many exciting things that are being accomplished in cities around the world. I work on Mexico City. Years ago, I talk about a city of sprawl. I even called it a planner's nightmare in the book I wrote on it like 20 years ago. I mean, it's a huge challenges of poverty, inequality, environmental degradation, sprawl, abandonment of housing, violence. But there are some incredibly wonderful things happening in the downtown areas, recovering history, recreating new public spaces. Now there are problems in other areas, but the discipline, our discipline, it never ends. Yeah. And that's the point. It's a constant. Cities are constantly dynamic, and our work is constantly dynamic, and there's never an end point. So when you start asking for a city as if it's reached that point of stasis, so this again, it's not you don't have to be able to identify one city as perfect or as a model. That's probably a mistake, but like look around the world for the exciting things, and our students do that, and what they see in one place, they maybe use and modify and transform in another place.
Rahul, Mehrotra, the final word.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you a question of what you meant by good, but Diane answered it, so thank you.
Rahul, Mehrotra, Neil Brenner, Diane Davis, Christopher Lee, Lars Lerup, Martha Welborn, and Jorge Silvetti, thank you so much.